Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Lawrence. All right, so I am actually just going to introduce Ellen. Ellen has a lot of expertise in this area of thinking about instructional sensitivity, thinking about bringing in the idea of validity of what we're doing, evidence-centered design, and is going to focus a lot on what we think is important, which is the alignment of what you're trying to do with what we're trying to achieve. So how do we design a test to get at our goals? One of the things Ellen and I have been working on, I started at the Center for Assessment several years ago, is thinking about how to build these validity arguments, building on Michael Kane's framework that Corinna just talked about, but doing so in a way that makes sense to practitioners, that they don't have to go read those big, huge volumes on validity to understand this. So with Mike Kane's blessing, we've been taking some of these, and he calls these things propositions, which we think is a big word, so we call them claims, again, trying to bring in some of the evidence-centered design. No laser pointer, huh? Oh, yeah. No. Tag on it. Okay, so just look to the left there. Claim one. So we set these up, I'll actually look at the bottom first. We set these things up with precursors and context, what is in the assessment system, what's in the outcomes, how do we use the scores, and then our goals. And Greta was talking a lot about the score uses. So as I said, we set these things up at claims, so if you just look left to right, it's almost a kind of an if-then statement. Each one of these things has to be true for us to meet our goals. Now we put this together as sort of a generic interpretive argument. We've been doing a lot of these generic things to try and get people started saying, you gotta have some of these things and you need to add to this depending on what some of your purposes, uses, goals are. So we've got some things that are content standards are designed to facilitate learning in a subject matter, building on knowledge, et cetera. What are the standards? How have the standards been developed? Claim 2 is about how you design the assessment. Claim 3 is administering the assessment. Claim 4 is the assessment performance levels. How are we actually bringing about things that we report on the assessment? Assessment outcomes, scores and performance levels are accurately reflect the level of knowledge and skills that each student has. One of the things that I would encourage people to do is take this more generic argument and think about how we would reformat it. And I'll talk about this tomorrow, how we would reformat it if we really focus on instructional sensitivity. Maybe we're not looking at Claim 5, how much knowledge and skills each student has. Maybe we're focusing on how much knowledge and skill each student has developed, has grown, has learned, has been taught. And that gets us some of change 6, is the change in individual assessment scores from one year to the next reflects the level of learning during the school year. I would say that's a huge piece. And for me, I said I was having a little bit of trouble with the distinction, I think, as was Rebecca, between what a student learns and what a student is taught. But the idea is where is that growth? Score uses. I think we spent the last 10, 11 years focusing on Claim 7. They're being used to evaluate student proficiency in subject matter. Where are they on our performance scale? Are they basic, below basic, proficient, advanced? Oh boy. Changes in assessment score can be used to evaluate teacher effectiveness. That's where we are today. And that's where we think that in order to do that well, we need to have instructionally sensitive tests. Claim 9, distribution across performance levels and changes in that distribution can be used to evaluate school and district quality. Again, NCLB, school quality, district quality. And some of our goals, our goals are really students leave the grade or school having gained sufficient knowledge and skills to do whatever's next. If in 3rd grade, it's to do well in 4th grade. If you're leaving high school, it's to do well in post-secondary training, school, jobs, whatever. We're looking to recognize teachers for their feedback, and not just recognize, but also give them feedback to improve. So are they doing a good job? If so, recognize it. Whether they're doing a good job or not, give them feedback on how to improve. Nobody's so good that they can't get better. And finally, on the school and district side, our tests are giving information about how to appropriately allocate resources. So these are the 3 goals we seem to be using the most in our testing. And I want to take, this is what we do for fun, is we take one of these claims. Again, we think this is fairly generic, and when we think some of the differences come is in the underpinnings, all the assumptions that fall within each of these claims. So we take one of these claims and we blow it up. So I took Claim 2. The assessment has been aligned to yield scores that reflect student knowledge and skills in relation to the academic standards. And these are the assumptions I think have to be true in order for that claim to be true. Which means as a researcher, you need to gather evidence about all of these things to show that that claim is true. So the assessment blueprint reflects the intended domain of a knowledge to be assessed, and you'll see some ECD terms in here. The item specifications capture the intended knowledge and skills. The items are written to allow students to provide evidence of their knowledge and skills. the type of task is appropriate to the knowledge and skills, and the rubrics are appropriate. And again, appropriate to what you're trying to do. So if what you're trying to do here is create instructionally sensitive items, then you need to add that term to the end of every one of these sentences and say what we're trying to do is find out how effective the instruction was. So I need items that are sensitive to the instruction. All of this, I would argue, falls under the heading of alignment. So with that, I'm going to turn it to you. Did you go back?
Yeah, this is not slide 1 again, it's slide 3, but I'm returning to the thought because this is how we structure our thinking. And I really do hope that within my professional lifetime that we do see instructional sensitivity become much more a core piece of what we think about testing. I hope I get to see the point where we forget about the traditional notions of blueprints and things like that and get to a point where we really can go deep on what kids know and can do. So that'd be great. I have a little time in my career yet, so hopefully we'll get there. I'm going to focus in a little bit and talk about some ideas. This is what we do in our work. This is what I do. I spend time thinking about the system, where the test lies within it, what the goals you're trying to achieve might be, and what pieces of the system need to be supported by evidence for us to be able to support the uses, interpretations of the test. So I'm going to focus a little bit here. So I'm going to gray out some of these boxes, apparently very slowly. Claim 2, the one that Marianne broke out a little bit, is there at the top. In the second column from the left. And I'm going to focus on these claims and these goals a little bit more as I go through what I'm here to present. And that'll happen today, I think. I should be pointing this somewhere else. There we go. Okay. So I've circulated them in 2 chunks because I'm going to have 2 big ideas, and I'm going to come to those next. So IS is instructional sensitivity, and I did have to chuckle to myself when I thought IS. So if anybody remembers back in the Clinton days when the big issue was, depends on what the meaning of is. So depends on what the meaning of IS is here. But I like Jim's definition. I'm sticking with that one. So in terms of the first big idea, so we understand that test scores are meant to generalize to a domain. They're not meant to, you sample a domain, right? And it's the score is a product of an interaction of a student and a student's characteristics and the sample of behaviors that you gather from that student. And the sample should be drawn from the domain to which you're trying to generalize. So you're trying to make a statement about what the student knows and can do in relation to a larger domain. So here, our assumption is that if testing information is meant to reflect what students have acquired in an instructional setting, then perhaps we do need to be able to distinguish between those which they have acquired in an instructional setting and those that they have acquired in other ways, as well as those that they have not acquired. So I'll remind you, I mentioned earlier to Alexa and to Rebecca, in some of Dylan Williams' writing, he points out that in the Welsh language and in Maori, there are at least 2 languages where there are not separate words for teaching and learning. There's one word. So without learning, there is no teaching. And you know that Dylan feels strongly about that. So we need to think about that. Maybe that wasn't a teacher, but somehow if a student acquires something, it's going to be either maturation or exposure, some kind of interaction, something happens. So we have one claim that we need, idea that addresses several claims here. The second big idea is that scores are used to evaluate, in some cases, students. In the NCLB achievement tests, that's not meant to be the case, except in the case of the English language proficiency assessments, where they actually do have individual student consequences. But they are used now to evaluate teachers, schools, and programs. And if that is the case, if you were trying to make a statement about whether a teacher, school, or program is effective, then you ought to have some evidence that the scores reflect effectiveness. And that's really what we're missing at this point. We get scores, and we're just so happy to have scores based on large numbers of students that we forget what those scores actually reflect and what they mean. So in one way, we could think of, when I go around gathering evidence for things, well, if I either do a within subject or between subject kind of design, and I look at kids before they're taught something and after, or I look at a group that was not going to be taught something, but they did something else on a different topic during that instructional segment. And then I would basically say, well, I would hope that there's a change between following instruction and before instruction, if it's something instructionally sensitive, and that there are some other relationships there that I kind of hope to be the case as well. But if you rely on that as your sole provider of the evidence of instructional sensitivity, you're sort of stuck. You're left with the mystery of how do we get there. So I propose that we really need a lot more information. I believe strongly that there has to be a body of evidence that addresses several sets of questions that together, and this is the big validity argument idea, but within each one of those claim boxes, you still need a body of evidence that addresses several different perspectives on that topic. So I would propose that these are some key components, and I'll talk just very briefly about each of them. First, you have to have a theory of domain knowledge and skill acquisition, and that's something that we've seen with dynamic learning maps, learning progressions, that kind of thing, where we have a sense of how, what the content of a domain is and how the knowledge and skills are structured, and we also have theories about knowledge and skill acquisition. We bring those together, and we have a theory of whatever our target set of goals might be, how we acquire knowledge and skills within that domain. And that is key number one, can't go forward without that. The next would be microgenetic studies. So if those of you who come out of educational psychology, remember Robert Siegler's work from about 20-some years ago, microgenetic, it's a terrible real name because it suggests that it's something it's not. What it really is taking, I pulled it out, but I didn't bring it up. Y'all carry one? Yeah. So taking a magnifying glass to a student's experience within a classroom. So you really look very closely. So it's not 6 times a year, it's not twice a year, it's really every day. And we learn from doing that how bumpy and messy learning is. You don't not get it, got it, done. It's really bumpy. Following students like that, we really get a much better set of information about our theory. That's testing our theory of knowledge acquisition, skill acquisition. We have to have some evidence that that theory actually holds. So I believe that that should be a part. Maybe that's not falling within the assessment validity evaluation heading, but I think somewhere we have to have some evidence that relies upon what is happening in a classroom to students with various characteristics being exposed in various ways to instruction before we jump to the end of the day and have the post hoc study that reflects back and just looks for differences between groups. Evidence-centered design principles, I believe, are also critical. We have to, in our test development process, be much more careful about what we're intending to measure and the array of characteristics that each item is meant to capture. It is not simply one focus on content or skill. It is multidimensional, and that how you present the item, the expectations you have for how students respond, and a full array of every possible, as close as you can get it, response option, and what that means, and how it plays into your theory of domain knowledge and skill acquisition. So evidence-centered design principles, and they're applied in many ways, and sometimes they're applied in ways that aren't particularly helpful, but by using those kinds of principles, you can begin to then subsequently study what it is that helps an item become or serve as an instructionally sensitive one, and a set of items form an instructionally sensitive test. So that allows us not only to know what it is, but to replicate it. So we get into the idea of item engineering, and that is the pathway to getting away from these blueprints that hold us back. Cognitive labs is something that is not an uncommon part of the test development process, but far too rarely done, to actually have students walk through and think aloud items. Varying item characteristics and student characteristics, so we know what is the best combination to get at what individual students know and can do. And finally, the instruction capture and quasi-experiments. Now that goes back to that matrix I had, so there's quasi-experiments, because we're really not gonna randomly assign students to these kinds of things. I think our RCT days are over, and I'm glad, but having different instructional settings for students and being able to study them is as close as you can in an experimental sense, but sometimes you have to just allow for it to be a natural setting. But the issue here for me is instruction capture, that it's very difficult for us to know what actually is, and I think this is gonna be a topic in others' talks. How do we capture what's actually happening in terms of instruction? Do not ask the teachers, because they're not going to tell you. You give them a list of things and they go, yeah, I taught that. That's really difficult. We've worked on different survey methodologies. We capture artifacts from classrooms. We've tried many ways to do this. I think asking students would be a helpful part of that. So I think it has to be multifaceted, but we need to do a better job of understanding what's happening in the classroom before we label it as good instruction or bad. And that can only help the teacher evaluation use of these scores. So here, I just do the picture. I'm just going to take exactly what I just said and give you the picture. So you have the domain content and structure, as well as knowledge and skill acquisition theory, informing our understanding of domain knowledge and skill acquisition. We have the microgenetic studies that are a bit of a test on that. And when you see green, that means it's a study or set of studies. So based on your theory, you can set pedagogical expectations, you can set develop curricula, and you can develop items and tests. Those all relate to each other, and I gain evidence through evidence-centered design principles. So I would design my evidence-centered design principles to help me generate tests and items that reflect my theory of domain knowledge and skill acquisition. And I test those items through cognitive labs, in addition to everything else that we do in testing our items. And then connecting the items and the pedagogical expectations would be those other studies. So this is putting the frame around a set of studies that would help to contribute to a validity evaluation process. And if I go back to the generic interpretive argument, or interpretation and use argument, 2013 language, I would start to say, okay, I got my theory that starts me off. That's your go. That's at the Monopoly board, that's number one. And then I can populate the rest of it with some studies showing how they relate to various ones of these claims. That's really not enough, though. As Marianne said, you have to break those claims out, and we go back and forth between whether in your illustration here, and I want to make this point because I think sometimes we get mixed up. This is not the interpretive argument. This is a graphic illustration of an interpretive argument. So that's an important distinction. You can draw pictures all day long, but you have to know what's behind these. Now, here's what's behind them. Or, as I say, because I'm spatial, I would rotate it 90 degrees, and there's a huge amount of stuff. This is the tip of the iceberg. And so you're building sets of assumptions. And Marianne showed you some of the assumptions that would go under Claim 2 and might relate to the notion of alignment. So these are the kinds of things we would need to study. Now, there's another challenge for you. What can we do to get rid of our current notions of alignment? Because they're goofy. At present, alignment is one of the gold standards, and that's partly because of the federal peer review process. And the alignment studies, here's how it works. No matter whose methodology you use, you bring together panels of teachers or other educators, you have them look at the standards and you have them rate them for, and this is really web, depth of knowledge, and then you have them look through a test booklet and you rate each item regarding which standard it best addresses, if any, and the depth of knowledge. And then they go away and you go in your back room and you do a bunch of analyses. And then you find out if your test is aligned. Really? You know, you gotta start at the beginning of the day with the evidence-centered design principles, and you have to evaluate the application, the definition and the application of those. That's key, and I think in days to come, we can't allow any test developer or user to get past Go unless they have some methodology for building in alignment from the start. Now, we need also at that point understand if instructional sensitivity is going to be a key target for us, that's where we build it in. We have to build templates, whatever you want to call them, and you don't have to use evidence-centered design principles, it could be other. We have to build in from the outset, as we define that construct, the dimensions on which those performance samples can and will vary. And at the same time, I hope you talk about it, Rebecca, how the students vary and how that interaction is really the key to it all. And it's the sample of those interactions that's the meaningful point. I'd like to see this, as I said at the beginning, in my career lifetime, certainly for large-scale assessments, but maybe the way to get there is to go in the back door and use these kinds of principles in building curricula and building formative kinds of tools. That we work with teachers in their daily practice with the students to think differently about how they gather information about what students know and can do, and so that their own questioning techniques are instructionally sensitive. Okay, and that's my time.